Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. There is a decision made on the 8th of March in the year 161 CE that has no precedent in 4 centuries of Roman imperial rule. The man who makes it is 40 years old. He has spent his entire adult life preparing for the office he has just inherited. He understands Roman law better than most of the jurists who advise him. He has studied philosophy with the seriousness that his tutors found by turns inspiring and unnerving. He has governed provinces by proxy, administered the daily machinery of empire from a position just behind a throne for 20 years. He knows exactly what he holds. He knows exactly what it cost the men who held it before him. And on the 2nd day of his reign, against all precedent and against the council of advisers who understood the political risks clearly, he insists on sharing it. The man he elevates is Lucius Verus, 30 years old, charming, pleasure-loving, a man whose military instincts will prove considerable and whose appetite for the comforts of power will prove larger still. Lucius has no legal claim to the throne. He is the adopted brother, a ward of the same dynastic arrangement that produced Marcus, but the legal succession ran to Marcus alone. Marcus could have given him a consulship, a command, a life of honored proximity to power. That would have been generous. It would also have been within the normal grammar of how Roman emperors managed potentially rival claimants. He didn't do that. He made him co-emperor, equal in title and in law, on the first morning of the new reign. Because Marcus Aurelius had spent 20 years studying what justice required of a man in his position, and this was what justice required. To understand why a man would do that, why someone standing at the apex of the most powerful political office in the Western world would voluntarily divide it on the first morning of his tenure, for no political gain and at considerable political risk, you have to go back, not to the moment of his birth, not to the precise legal mechanisms of the adoption that made him heir. You have to go back to what kind of person is shaped by 20 years of deliberate, privately sustained philosophical practice. You have to understand what Marcus Aurelius believed, not as a matter of stated conviction, but as a matter of daily, pre-dawn, lamp oil and papyrus practice. The co-emperorship is not a policy decision. It is a character decision, and that character was formed over decades, carefully, in the quiet before the household woke. Marcus Annius Verus, he would not take the name Marcus Aurelius until his adoption, was born in Rome on the 26th of April, 121 CE. His family was Spanish in origin, senatorial in standing, wealthy and connected without being conspicuous. His father died when he was young, and the boy was raised by his grandfather and by a network of tutors assembled with the particular seriousness of a Roman patrician who understood that good tutors were the most valuable investment a family could make. He showed something early. The tutors noticed it. He was not merely bright. Roman aristocratic education produced plenty of bright students. He was earnest in a way that unsettled people accustomed to intelligence deployed primarily for advantage. He wanted to understand things, not to be known as someone who understood them. There is a difference. In a culture saturated with the performance of virtue, a boy who actually intended to practice it looked peculiar. He began wearing a philosopher's cloak in his early teens. His family, indulgent and slightly bewildered, allowed it. The tutors were extraordinary. There was Fronto, Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the finest Latin rhetorician of his generation, a man who considered his correspondence with the young Marcus among the more significant relationships of his career. Fronto could make Latin do things that made senators forget they were being persuaded. He tried with considerable patience and considerable warmth to make Marcus care about rhetoric the way a craftsman cares about his tools, because a man who would one day govern Rome needed to move audiences, and there was no better instrument for that purpose. Marcus studied. He learned. He became, by Fronto's account, a student of genuine ability. And then he made a choice that Fronto experienced as a kind of loss. Not abruptly, not without courtesy. The correspondence continued, warm, affectionate, full of the particular mutual respect of two men who have spent years thinking together, even when they've been thinking in different directions. But somewhere in his late teens and early 20s, Marcus turned away from rhetoric and toward philosophy. He chose the examined life over the persuasive one. He chose Epictetus over Cicero. The man who guided that choice was Quintus Junius Rusticus. Rusticus was not the most celebrated of Marcus's teachers. He was the most important. He was a Stoic philosopher, a Roman senator, a man of practical experience who had no patience for philosophy as ornament, who understood Stoicism not as a set of elegant propositions about the universe, but as a discipline, a daily practice, a set of tools for the specific problem of being a human being inside a world that will, without question, eventually attempt to break you. It was Rusticus who placed in Marcus's hands the discourses of Epictetus. Epictetus had been a slave, owned by one of Nero's freedmen. By some accounts, the man had broken one of his legs, to test, apparently, whether he would cry out. He had not. He had told his master with calm precision that the leg would break. It did. And Epictetus, who could not control what was done to his body, had spent the remainder of his life thinking carefully about what a person can and cannot control, and what freedom means when the external world is entirely outside your reach. The discourses that emerged from his teaching were not abstract philosophy. They were instructions for a specific kind of survival. Marcus read them and recognized something. He recognized the practice. That is the precise word for what Stoicism was to Marcus Aurelius. Not a belief system he professed, but a practice he sustained, daily, with the consistency a craftsman gives to his trade. The evidence is private. No one was meant to read it. The notebooks that survive, the collection we call the Meditations, were written in Greek, in the first person, apparently in the morning hours before the day's governance began. They are not a philosophical treatise. They are not a record of conclusions. They are a record of someone trying. They are full of self-reproach. He reminds himself to stop caring about reputation, then, pages later, reminds himself again, because the first reminder didn't hold. He tells himself to stop being irritated by difficult people, that such people cannot help their natures, that irritation serves no purpose. Then returns to the same instruction, apparently still being irritated. The notebooks of a man who has achieved perfect philosophical equanimity look very different from these. These are the notebooks of a man who has set an extremely high standard and who is, every morning, measuring the distance between where he is and where his philosophy insists he should be. That gap, private, unperformative, honestly recorded, is the most human thing about him. In the year 138, when Marcus was 17 years old, the Emperor Hadrian was dying. Hadrian had no direct heir. The succession was a problem he addressed with characteristic administrative thoroughness. He engineered it across 2 generations. He adopted Antoninus Pius, a senator of distinguished record and undemonstrative competence, on one specific condition, that Antoninus in turn adopt 2 children of his choosing. Marcus Annius Verus was one, 17 years old, already identified as exceptional. Lucius Sionius Commodus was the other, 7 years old, a child who would one day become Lucius Verus. That gap in ages was not incidental. Hadrian was not merely naming successors. He was sequencing them, staggering the generations, building a dynasty across a longer horizon than most emperors bothered to imagine. Marcus did not choose this. He was informed of it. The machinery of empire had identified him the way one identifies a suitable instrument. He was exceptional, certainly, but exceptionality was the criterion, not the point. The point was succession. The point was stability. The point was that Hadrian, who had spent his reign consolidating an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, was not going to leave it to chance. The purple was placed on shoulders that had not reached for it. The 20 years that followed were not dramatic. That is precisely their significance. Marcus served as Caesar, heir apparent, consul twice, present at every session of the imperial council, close enough to the practice of governance to understand it without yet bearing its full weight. Antoninus Pius was, by every account, a capable and steady emperor, not brilliant, not transformative, but reliably excellent in the way that genuinely excellent governance is often reliably unspectacular. He did not fight unnecessary wars. He did not persecute his enemies. He administered justice with the steadiness of a man who finds administration genuinely interesting rather than tedious. Marcus watched him for 20 years. He watched how Antoninus handled senators who disagreed, with patience rather than force, because force creates resentment and patience creates, occasionally, agreement. He watched how his adoptive father carried the frontier reports, the financial accounts, the slow, unglamorous weight of empire administered day by day without the compensating rush of military glory. He watched what it cost a man to govern well and remain recognizably himself while doing it. He was still writing before dawn, still measuring the distance. Faustina bore him 14 children. 6 survived to adulthood. The Meditations do not dwell on the deaths. Marcus Aurelius was not a man who dwelt publicly on anything, but the losses are present in the texture of what he wrote. the recurring insistence on impermanence, the practiced acknowledgement that the things we love will be taken, the discipline of receiving loss as a fact of the world rather than an argument against it. These were not abstract propositions for a man who had buried 8 of his children. They were the specific, private, daily work of a person trying to remain functional and capable of governing the thing that had been given to him to govern. He was not invulnerable. He was practiced. On the 7th of March in 161, Antoninus Pius died at his country estate at Laurium. He spent his final days with the unhurried deliberateness of a man settling accounts before a long journey. He called his officers. He named his successor. He gave the watchword to the guard, aequanimitas, equanimity. Then he turned over and went to sleep. Marcus Aurelius was 40 years old. The empire was at peace. The treasury was full. The legions were, for the moment, stable on their frontiers. The most prepared man ever to inherit the Roman throne stood at the apex of it and felt, if the evidence of his notebooks can be trusted, not triumph. Wait. He went to Lucius Verus. He divided the office. He did what his philosophy told him was right. It was still March. The borders were quiet. The harvests had not yet failed. The philosophy that Marcus Aurelius had spent 20 years building, every pre-dawn hour, every page of private self-examination, every decision that disappointed a teacher because it was made on principle rather than advantage, had not yet been tested at full force. Soon enough, it would be. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.